In the middle of the Middle Ages, roads are muddy, villages are quiet after sunset, and the air smells of wood smoke. Kings argue over borders far away, and many people worry about the next harvest more than any grand idea. Yet tucked behind stone walls and wooden gates, there are places where candles never seem to go out, and pages whisper when no one is speaking. These are the monasteries. They are calm from the outside, but inside they carry a heartbeat made of ink, prayer, and questions that could change a life. Imagine walking through one of those gates for the first time. The courtyard is simple, the cloister cool under the arches, and somewhere a bell rings with a slow, steady rhythm. A young novice passes by, holding a bundle of parchment like it is something fragile and alive. You can hear the low murmur of voices from the chapel, and from another building, the soft scratch of quills. It feels safe, but not sleepy. It feels like a place where memories are carefully carried from one hand to the next. People often say the Middle Ages were dark, as if the whole world forgot how to think. But step into the scriptorium and you will see light everywhere. A monk warms his hands over a candle and then bends close to the page. He copies a sentence from an old Greek thinker, then adds a small note in the margin. A gentle question to the reader: does reason help faith grow, or does it bring doubt? Another monk mixes colors from crushed minerals to paint a tiny bird in the corner of the page, not because he must, but because beauty helps the mind breathe. Now here is the hard part, the part most people do not see. These men chose this life. They left behind families, fields, and familiar laughter for a rhythm of silence, work, and prayer. They traded the warmth of a busy home for the long patience of learning. That choice was not simple. Imagine being told, you can spend your days with the wisdom of centuries, but you must let go of much that you love. Would you do it? Some did. And because they did, stories survived. A poem that would have disappeared in a damp cellar found a second life in a monastery library. A text on the movement of the stars crossed mountains, copied and recopied, until it reached a new set of eyes that looked up at the night with wonder. In one quiet abbey, a monk who could barely see anymore recited whole pages from memory, so a younger brother could write them down. His voice made the letters appear. In another, a scholar ran his fingers over a simple instrument that could tell time by the sky, and he smiled like someone who had just opened a door in his mind. It was not only prayer that lived there, it was curiosity, careful and humble. It asked small questions, the kind that turn into big ones if you follow them long enough. How do plants heal wounds? How can we measure a year more accurately? When should we plant to help a village eat through winter? A monastery was a crossroads where faith met daily life, where wisdom was not just stored on shelves but carried into the fields, the workshop, and the infirmary. Of course, there were doubts. There were moments when a monk looked at a page that contradicted a teaching he cherished and felt a knot in his chest. Should he close the book or keep reading? Should he trust the old way or test a new path? The walls did not protect them from hard questions. They gave those questions space to breathe. So when we look at those stone arches and quiet gardens, we are not only seeing a past that is ended, we are seeing a choice that still whispers to us today. If the price of deep knowledge were to give up comfort, habits, and even the approval of others, what would you do? Would you step through the gate, let the bell draw you into a different rhythm, and trade certainty for careful thinking and long patience? If you love history and want to uncover how these hidden places shape the world, like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives, and come along with me. There are more doors to open, more pages to turn, and more voices from the past waiting to speak. Picture this. The year is 476, and the last Roman emperor has just been deposed. Across Europe, cities that once bustled with trade and learning are crumbling into ruin. Libraries that housed thousands of scrolls are being abandoned, their precious knowledge scattered to the winds. The great aqueducts are falling apart, and the roads that once connected a mighty empire are becoming overgrown with weeds. But here's where our story takes an incredible turn. While kingdoms rose and fell around them, a quiet revolution was taking place behind the stone walls of monasteries scattered across the continent. These weren't just places of prayer. They had become the last bastions of human knowledge, the final flickering candles in what many call the Dark Ages. Imagine walking into the monastery of Saint Martin of Tours in the early 6th century. The air is thick with the scent of parchment and ink, and you can hear the soft scratching of quills against paper. Here, dozens of monks are carefully copying texts that would otherwise vanish forever. They're not just preserving Christian writings, they're saving works by Aristotle, medical treatises by ancient Greek physicians, mathematical texts that contain the secrets of geometry and astronomy. One of the most fascinating figures of this era was Alcuin of York, a brilliant scholar who found himself caught between two worlds. Born in the 8th century in northern England, Alcuin possessed something extraordinary, a deep love for both Christian faith and ancient Greek philosophy. When Charlemagne, the future Holy Roman Emperor, invited him to court, Alcuin faced an incredible challenge. You see, many church leaders of that time viewed Greek philosophy with deep suspicion. They worried that the logical arguments of Aristotle and Plato might lead people away from faith. Some even considered these ancient texts dangerous to Christian souls. But Alcuin believed something revolutionary, that reason and faith could work together, that understanding God's creation through logic and study was actually a form of worship. Picture Alcuin in his study, surrounded by scrolls and codices, wrestling with questions that would shape European thought for centuries. How do you honor both the wisdom of ancient Athens and the teachings of Christ? How do you convince suspicious church officials that studying Aristotle won't corrupt young minds? Night after night, he worked to create a synthesis, a bridge between classical learning and Christian doctrine. But perhaps the most moving story from this period involves a monk whose name has been lost to history, though some sources refer to him as Brother Evaristo. What makes his story so remarkable is that he was completely blind, yet he became one of the most important preservers of ancient knowledge. Here's how it worked. Evaristo would sit for hours as other monks read entire books aloud to him. His memory was so extraordinary that he could memorize complete texts, not just the main ideas, but every word, every punctuation mark. Then, when scribes were ready to copy, Evaristo would dictate these works back to them, essentially becoming a living library. Can you imagine the dedication this required? Day after day, Evaristo would commit to memory works on mathematics, theology, medicine, and philosophy. His fellow monks said he could recite the entire works of Augustine from memory, along with dozens of other texts. In a world where a single book represented months of labor and cost more than most people earned in a year, Evaristo's mind held treasures beyond measure. This obsession with memory wasn't unique to Evaristo. Medieval monks developed techniques for memorization that would amaze us today. They created elaborate mental maps, associating different parts of texts with specific locations in their monasteries. A monk might remember the beginning of Virgil's Aeneid by picturing the monastery gate, the middle sections by visualizing the chapel, and the ending by thinking of the bell tower. What's truly remarkable is that these monks weren't just passively copying texts, they were actively engaging with them, debating their meanings and sometimes adding their own insights in the margins. The monasteries became centers of intellectual ferment, places where the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome was not only preserved, but transformed and enriched. This preservation effort was happening across Europe, from the remote monasteries of Ireland, where monks illuminated manuscripts with breathtaking artistry, to the great abbeys of France and Germany, where scholars gathered to debate and discuss. Each monastery became a repository of human knowledge, a fortress protecting our intellectual heritage from the chaos of war and upheaval. The monks' work during these centuries laid the foundation for everything that would come later. The great universities of the 12th century, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution. Without their patient, dedicated efforts, countless works of ancient wisdom would have been lost forever, and the trajectory of Western civilization would have been completely different. Now, let me tell you about a young man whose story perfectly captures the impossible choices people faced during these times. His name was Gawain, and he came from a noble family in what we now call France during the early 9th century. But this isn't the Gawain you might know from Arthurian legends. This was a real person, torn between two worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. Gawain's father was a powerful lord who controlled vast lands and hundreds of serfs. The family's honor was built on military prowess, on their ability to defend their territory and lead men into battle. For generations, the sons of this noble house had followed the same path: learn to fight, inherit land, marry strategically, and continue the family line. It was a simple formula that had worked for centuries. But Gawain was different. From childhood, he had been fascinated not by swords and horses, but by books and ideas. When he was 12, he encountered a traveling monk who carried with him a manuscript containing geometric proofs by Euclid. The young boy became transfixed by the elegant logic, the way mathematical truths built upon each other like a perfectly constructed cathedral of thought. His father was horrified. Here was his eldest son, heir to everything the family had built, more interested in abstract mathematics than in the practical skills needed to rule. The tension in their household became unbearable. Family dinners turned into bitter arguments about duty, honor, and the proper role of a nobleman's son. Picture this scene: Gawain, now 15, sitting in the castle's great hall as his father rails against his scholarly interests. "These books," his father shouts, "what good are they when raiders cross our borders? Can your precious Aristotle command troops? Can your geometry feed our people during a harsh winter?" But Gawain couldn't let go of his hunger for knowledge. He began making secret visits to a nearby monastery, where an elderly monk named Brother Thomas had agreed to teach him Latin and introduce him to the works of ancient philosophers. These clandestine lessons became the highlight of Gawain's week. He would slip away from military training, claiming he was hunting, and spend hours in the monastery's scriptorium, copying texts and engaging in discussions that set his mind on fire. The monastery itself represented a different kind of tension, one that Gawain couldn't fully comprehend at his young age. Here's what was happening. While monks spent their days carefully copying manuscripts and debating theological questions, the world outside their walls was suffering in ways that would break your heart. The year was 847, and a devastating plague was sweeping across Europe. Unlike the famous Black Death that would come centuries later, this epidemic primarily affected the poor and malnourished. Peasant families were dying in their hovels, while nobles in their castles and monks in their monasteries remained largely protected by better food, cleaner water, and stone walls that kept out the worst of the disease. One autumn day, as Gawain was leaving the monastery after a particularly enlightening discussion about Plato's Republic, he encountered a group of desperate villagers who had come seeking help. Their leader, a weathered man named Henri, whose own children had already succumbed to the plague, stood at the monastery gates with fury burning in his eyes. "Look at them," Henri said, pointing toward the monks who were visible through the windows of the scriptorium, bent over their manuscripts. "Look how they spend their days copying pretty words while our children waste away. Your books don't fill empty bellies. Your prayers don't cure fever." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Gawain had ever witnessed. Henri continued, his voice rising with each word. "You hoard knowledge like dragons hoard gold, while we die in ignorance. You speak of God's love, but where is that love when a mother watches her baby starve?" Brother Thomas, who had emerged to face the angry villagers, tried to explain that the monastery did provide what help it could, sharing food from their gardens, offering herbal remedies, praying for the sick. But his words sounded hollow even to Gawain's young ears. The monastery's granaries were full while the village went hungry. The monks' cells were warm and dry while peasant families shivered in leaky huts. This moment changed something fundamental in Gawain's understanding of the world. He began to see the terrible irony of his situation. He was privileged enough to pursue knowledge because others worked the fields that fed him. The manuscripts he loved so dearly existed because countless unnamed people lived and died in ignorance, their labor supporting a system that kept learning locked away from them. The monks themselves were not unaware of this contradiction. Many genuinely struggled with the tension between their calling to preserve knowledge and their duty to serve the poor. Some monasteries did remarkable work feeding the hungry and caring for the sick, but the fundamental inequality remained. In a world where perhaps one person in 100 could read, where a single book cost more than a peasant family's entire annual income, Learning was inevitably the privilege of the few. Gawain found himself caught in the middle of this moral maze. His family expected him to abandon his scholarly pursuits and embrace his role as a future lord. The monks welcomed his intellectual gifts, but couldn't offer him a path that would satisfy his conscience. And the suffering people outside the monastery walls reminded him daily of the cost of his education. What makes Gawain's story so compelling is that there were no easy answers. This wasn't a simple tale of good versus evil, but rather a complex web of competing values and impossible choices. Should he honor his family's expectations and abandon his love of learning? Should he join the monastery and dedicate his life to preserving knowledge, even knowing that this knowledge would remain inaccessible to those who needed it most? Or was there some third way, some path that could bridge these seemingly irreconcilable worlds? This tension between intellectual pursuit and social responsibility wasn't unique to Gawain's time. It echoes through history, reminding us that the pursuit of knowledge has always come with moral complications, and that wisdom without compassion can become its own form of blindness. But here's where our story takes a darker turn, revealing secrets that most people never knew existed within those sacred walls. Deep within the monasteries, behind locked doors and hidden chambers, lay what we might call the forbidden libraries, collections of texts that church authorities deemed too dangerous for ordinary minds to encounter. Let me introduce you to Abbot Theodoric, a learned man who ruled over the monastery of St. Benedictus in what is now southern Germany during the late 8th century. Theodoric was no simple religious figure. He had studied in Rome, spoke fluent Greek, and possessed one of the sharpest theological minds of his generation. Yet it was precisely his intelligence that made him so dangerous to the preservation of knowledge. Picture this. It's a cold winter evening in the year 792. Brother Marcus, the monastery's most skilled copyist, has just completed transcribing an ancient Greek medical text that describes the circulation of blood through the human body. This particular manuscript, written by a physician from Alexandria centuries earlier, contained observations about anatomy that were remarkably accurate, some that wouldn't be officially discovered again until the Renaissance. But there was a problem. The text suggested that illness was caused by natural processes within the body, not by spiritual corruption or divine punishment, as church doctrine maintained. Even worse, it described surgical procedures that required cutting into the human body, something the church had forbidden as a violation of God's sacred creation. Brother Marcus, excited by what he had learned, brought the completed manuscript to Abbot Theodoric for approval. What happened next reveals the complex moral calculations that medieval religious authorities faced every day. Theodoric spent 3 sleepless nights reading and rereading the medical treatise. He could see its value. The knowledge contained within could potentially save lives, ease suffering, advance human understanding of God's creation. But he also saw the danger. If this information spread, it might undermine people's faith in prayer and divine healing. It could lead to practices the church considered blasphemous. On the 4th morning, Theodoric made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He summoned Brother Marcus to his chambers and, without explanation, threw the manuscript into the fireplace. Months of painstaking work, irreplaceable knowledge from the ancient world, went up in flames in a matter of minutes. "Father," Brother Marcus whispered, watching the parchment curl and blacken, "why destroy such wisdom?" Theodoric's response reveals the agonizing position many church leaders found themselves in. "Sometimes, my son, we must protect souls even from truth itself. This knowledge is not evil, but in the wrong hands it could lead the faithful away from God. I destroy it not from hatred of learning, but from love of our people." But Theodoric's actions were just one example of a much broader practice that was happening across medieval Europe. Monks were regularly altering, editing, and sometimes completely rewriting ancient texts to make them conform to Christian doctrine. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval monks invented one of the most wasteful practices in literary history. They would take ancient manuscripts, sometimes the only surviving copies of works by Greek philosophers, Roman historians, or medical authorities, and literally scrape the ink off the parchment so they could reuse it for copying religious texts. This practice was called creating a palimpsest, and it happened thousands of times across Europe. Imagine priceless works by authors we'll never know, scientific discoveries that could have advanced human knowledge by centuries, all erased so that monks could copy yet another psalter or book of prayers. Sometimes, though, the original text wasn't completely removed. Modern scholars using special imaging techniques have been able to recover some of these erased works, revealing lost treasures of ancient knowledge. In one famous case, a 10th century prayer book was discovered to contain underneath it the only surviving copy of a work by Archimedes that revolutionized our understanding of ancient mathematics. But the practice of textual manipulation went beyond simply erasing and reusing parchment. Monks would often change specific passages that contradicted church teaching while leaving the rest of the text intact. A medical text might have its section on anatomy altered to remove references to dissecting corpses. A philosophical work might have dangerous questions about the nature of God subtly reworded to provide more acceptable answers. Brother Felix, a monk working in the early 9th century, left us a fascinating glimpse into this process through his personal notes. He describes struggling with a manuscript by the ancient physician Galen that contained detailed observations about human anatomy based on dissection. Felix admired Galen's scientific method and accuracy, but he knew that copying the text unchanged would anger his superiors. His solution was remarkably clever. He kept Galen's medical recommendations and treatments, which had proven effective, but rewrote the explanatory sections to suggest that this knowledge came through divine inspiration rather than through cutting open human bodies. In Felix's version, Galen was portrayed as receiving his anatomical insights through mystical visions rather than through empirical observation. This wasn't necessarily malicious. Many monks genuinely believed they were improving these texts, making ancient wisdom compatible with Christian truth. But the cumulative effect was staggering. Countless works of science, philosophy, and medicine were subtly altered or completely destroyed, creating gaps in human knowledge that would take centuries to fill. The tragedy is that much of this lost knowledge could have prevented enormous suffering. Medical texts that described effective treatments for common diseases were destroyed because they challenged religious explanations for illness. Mathematical works that could have advanced engineering and architecture were lost because they contained ideas that seemed to conflict with biblical cosmology. Yet here's the most fascinating part of this story. Even as some monks were destroying dangerous knowledge, others were secretly preserving it. Hidden away in remote monasteries, often in violation of official church policy, brave individuals were maintaining complete, unaltered copies of controversial texts. These secret preservers understood something profound: that truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to suppress it. They believed that future generations would be wise enough to handle knowledge that their own era found too dangerous to accept. And you know what? Here's something that might blow your mind. Medieval monks were essentially doing the same thing that happens today when texts get edited or censored. They were making decisions about what knowledge was safe for people to have and what might be too dangerous. The big question is, do you think they were right to sacrifice certain truths to maintain peace and faith? Or should knowledge always be preserved, no matter what the consequences might be? If you're enjoying this video, please like, share, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel. Now, let me tell you about one of the most extraordinary figures in medieval history. A man whose story reads like something from a fantasy novel, yet every word of it is true. His name was Gerbert of Aurillac, and he would become the most controversial pope in history, accused of selling his soul to the devil in exchange for forbidden knowledge. Picture this. It's a moonless night in the year 978. Deep within the monastery of Saint-Géraud in southern France, a lone figure moves quietly through the shadowed corridors. The monastery bells have just finished tolling midnight, their bronze voices echoing across the valley like a warning. Brother Gerbert pulls his rough woolen hood lower over his face as he makes his way to a hidden chamber beneath the scriptorium. What Gerbert is about to do could cost him everything: his position in the monastery, his reputation, possibly even his life. Carefully, he reaches beneath his habit and withdraws an object that would terrify most Christians of his time: an astrolabe, an intricate bronze instrument covered with Arabic inscriptions and mysterious geometric patterns. To understand why this moment was so dangerous, you need to know that Gerbert was living in an age when most Europeans viewed mathematics with deep suspicion. Numbers beyond basic counting were considered mysterious, almost magical. Complex calculations were seen as a form of sorcery, and the advanced mathematical techniques that Islamic scholars had developed were regarded as devil's work by many church authorities. But Gerbert had experienced something that changed his life forever. Years earlier, as a young monk, he had traveled to the border regions between Christian and Islamic Spain. There, in the city of Vic, he encountered something that European scholars had almost forgotten existed, a sophisticated mathematical tradition that made European learning look primitive by comparison. Islamic mathematicians had preserved and expanded upon the works of ancient Greek masters like Euclid and Ptolemy. They had developed algebra, refined geometry, created precise astronomical instruments, and invented mathematical concepts that wouldn't reach the rest of Europe for another 2 centuries. When Gerbert first saw these Islamic scholars calculating the movements of planets with stunning accuracy, predicting eclipses years in advance, and using instruments that could measure time and position with incredible precision, he felt like a caveman who had suddenly glimpsed the future. The astrolabe he now held in his trembling hands was a masterpiece of medieval technology. This bronze disc, no larger than a dinner plate, was essentially a 2-dimensional computer that could solve dozens of complex astronomical problems. With it, you could determine the time, day or night, find your latitude, predict the rising and setting of stars, and calculate the length of daylight at any time of year. But here's what made Gerbert's situation so precarious. This knowledge came from the Islamic world, from scholars who followed a different faith. Many of his fellow Christians believed that accepting any learning from Muslim sources was tantamount to consorting with demons. The fact that these instruments worked so perfectly only made them more terrifying. Surely, people whispered, such accuracy could only come from supernatural sources. Night after night, Gerbert would slip away to his secret chamber, studying Arabic mathematical texts by candlelight, practicing calculations that seemed like magic to his contemporaries. He learned to use the abacus with techniques unknown in Europe, mastered geometric proofs that had been lost for centuries, and began to understand astronomical principles that made the crude European calendar system look laughable. The risk he was taking becomes clear when you consider what happened to other scholars who dared to study Islamic learning too openly. Just 20 years earlier, a monk in northern Italy had been accused of witchcraft simply for demonstrating how to calculate square roots. Another scholar in Germany was nearly burned at the stake for suggesting that the earth might be round, an idea he had learned from Arabic texts. But Gerbert couldn't stop himself. The beauty and elegance of this mathematical knowledge was like a drug to his brilliant mind. He began to see patterns in creation that had been invisible to him before, to understand the harmony that governed the movements of celestial bodies, to glimpse the underlying mathematical principles that seemed to govern everything from music to architecture to the changing seasons. As his reputation for unusual learning spread, rumors began to follow him like shadows. People whispered that he had made a pact with the devil during his travels in Spain. They claimed he possessed a bronze head that could speak and answer any question, a garbled reference to his astrolabe, which could indeed provide answers to complex astronomical questions that seemed impossible to solve by normal means. The situation became even more complicated when Gerbert's exceptional abilities caught the attention of powerful political figures. Otto II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was fascinated by this monk who could predict eclipses and calculate the most auspicious times for important events. Soon Gerbert found himself appointed as tutor to the young Otto III, teaching the future emperor mathematics and astronomy, using techniques that most of Europe considered heretical. But the most remarkable twist in Gerbert's story was yet to come. Despite the accusations of witchcraft, despite the suspicion of his fellow clergy, despite the dangerous nature of his learning, Gerbert's brilliance eventually carried him to the very pinnacle of Christian authority. In the year 999, he was elected pope, taking the name Sylvester II. Imagine the irony. The man accused of selling his soul to the devil became the earthly representative of Christ. The monk who had hidden his astrolabe in fear of persecution now wore the papal crown and ruled over all of Christendom. As Pope, Gerbert faced an impossible balancing act. He had to maintain his position as the spiritual leader of Christian Europe, while secretly using knowledge that many of his followers considered demonic. He continued his mathematical work in private, but publicly he had to be careful not to display too much of his unusual learning. The legends that grew up around Pope Sylvester II became even more fantastic after his death. People claimed he had built a mechanical clock that could predict the future, that he possessed books written by demons, that he had learned to fly through the air using supernatural powers. These stories, as wild as they sound, were actually distorted memories of real achievements. His mechanical timepieces were indeed revolutionary. His books did contain knowledge that seemed magical to medieval minds, and his understanding of geography and astronomy did give him insights that appeared almost prophetic. What makes Gerbert's story so compelling is that he embodied the fundamental tension of his age, the conflict between faith and reason, between traditional Christian learning and the revolutionary ideas flowing in from the Islamic world. He proved that knowledge, no matter how dangerous or controversial, has a way of finding champions willing to risk everything to preserve and advance it. The bronze astrolabe that Gerbert once hid beneath his habit represented something profound, the unstoppable human drive to understand our universe, even when that understanding challenges everything we think we know. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval monasteries, there's one more story I need to share with you, and this one might be the most important of all because it's still happening today. Let me paint you a picture of what learning looked like in the year 1000. Imagine a world where only one person out of every 100 could read their own name. Picture vast kingdoms where the ability to write a simple sentence was so rare that scribes commanded the same respect as we give to rocket scientists today. In this world, a single book cost more than a peasant family's entire yearly income, and owning a small personal library marked you as one of the wealthiest people in your region. The monasteries we've been exploring weren't just centers of learning. They were fortresses of privilege, places where knowledge was hoarded like treasure in a dragon's cave. And here's the uncomfortable truth. For all their noble work in preserving ancient wisdom, these institutions also created and maintained one of history's most rigid systems of intellectual inequality. Think about Brother Thomas, whom we met earlier teaching young Gawain in secret. Thomas himself had come from a noble family, one wealthy enough to donate significant lands to the monastery in exchange for accepting their son as a novice. His path to literacy and learning was paved with gold, quite literally. Meanwhile, the children of the peasants who worked those same donated lands would live and die without ever seeing the inside of a book. This wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. It was the entire structure of medieval society. Knowledge was power, and power was carefully controlled. The monasteries served as gatekeepers, deciding not just what information would be preserved, but who would have access to it. They created what we might call the world's first artificial scarcity of education. Here's a detail that really drives this home. In many monasteries, the punishment for teaching a peasant to read was the same as the punishment for stealing from the church treasury. Both were considered forms of theft, one of gold, the other of something even more precious, the exclusive right to knowledge. But perhaps the most telling example comes from the monastery of Cluny in France during the 11th century. The abbot there, a man named Hugh, was renowned for his learning and wisdom. Nobles from across Europe would send their sons to study under him, paying enormous fees for the privilege. Yet when a local miller's daughter showed exceptional intelligence and begged to be taught to read, Hugh refused, explaining that education would only make her discontent with her proper station in life. This girl, whose name was recorded as Marguerite, had taught herself to recognize letters by studying the inscriptions on gravestones in the monastery cemetery. She could solve mathematical problems in her head that stumped some of the noble students. But because she was born into the wrong social class, her talents were considered not just irrelevant, but actually dangerous to the social order. The parallel to our modern world is striking and uncomfortable. Today we like to think we've moved beyond such obvious inequality in education. Yet consider this. While medieval monasteries restricted learning based on birth and wealth, we've created new barriers that serve similar functions. Think about how knowledge is distributed in our digital age. Yes, information is more available than ever before, but meaningful access to quality education, to mentorship, to the social networks that turn raw knowledge into real opportunity, these remain heavily concentrated among the privileged. A child born into a wealthy family today has access to private tutors, elite schools, unpaid internships, and family connections that can open doors. Meanwhile, a brilliant kid from a struggling family might have access to the same Wikipedia articles, but lacks the support system to transform that information into life-changing opportunities. The medieval monastery's scriptorium, where valuable manuscripts were carefully copied by hand, has evolved into today's prestigious universities, where valuable knowledge and credentials are carefully distributed to those who can afford the increasingly astronomical costs. Just as medieval monks controlled access to literacy, today's institutions often function as gatekeepers to the kind of education that leads to real economic and social mobility. But here's where the story gets interesting. Just as some medieval monks secretly worked to spread knowledge beyond monastery walls, there are people today who are trying to break down these new barriers to learning. Remember Brother Marcus, the copyist who saw his medical manuscript burned? History suggests that there were many others like him, monks who secretly made extra copies of important texts and found ways to share them beyond the monastery. They understood that knowledge, like water, naturally wants to flow to where it's needed most. Today, we see echoes of this spirit in online educators who create free courses, in programmers who develop open-source software, in researchers who make their findings freely available instead of locking them behind expensive academic paywalls. They're following in the footsteps of those medieval rebels who believed that wisdom shouldn't be hoarded by the few. The monasteries did preserve invaluable knowledge through the Dark Ages. There's no question about that. The texts they copied, the ideas they maintained, the intellectual traditions they protected, all of these contributions were essential to human progress. But they also created a model of education as an exclusive privilege rather than a universal right. What's fascinating is that this tension between preservation and access, between maintaining quality and ensuring equality, still defines our educational debates today. We still argue about who deserves access to the best learning opportunities, about whether knowledge should be free, or whether it needs to be expensive to maintain its value, about the responsibility of institutions to serve society versus their need to sustain themselves. The medieval monasteries taught us something profound about the double-edged nature of intellectual institutions. They can be simultaneously the saviors and the gatekeepers of human knowledge. They can preserve wisdom for future generations while denying it to the people who need it most in the present. Perhaps the most important lesson from our journey through these medieval halls of learning is this: knowledge has always been political. The decision of what to preserve, what to destroy, who to teach, and who to exclude, these aren't neutral technical choices. They're decisions about what kind of society we want to build and who we believe deserves to participate in shaping our collective future. The monasteries of medieval Europe created a legacy that's still with us today. They showed us both the incredible power of dedicated institutions to preserve and advance human knowledge, and the terrible danger that comes when such institutions become too isolated from the people they're meant to serve. The question we face now is the same one that confronted Brother Thomas when he had to decide whether to teach that eager young nobleman. Do we use our knowledge to reinforce existing hierarchies, or do we use it to build bridges toward a more just and equal world? So here we are, at the end of our journey through the stone corridors and candlelit chambers of medieval monasteries. And what have we discovered? Something far more complex and fascinating than the simple story we're usually told. These monasteries gave us both light and shadow, hope and heartbreak. They were the places where civilization's most precious treasures were lovingly preserved, where dedicated souls spent their entire lives copying manuscripts that would otherwise have vanished forever. Without their patient work, we might have lost the wisdom of Aristotle, the medical knowledge of ancient physicians, the mathematical insights that would later fuel the Renaissance. But they were also places where knowledge was rationed like bread during a famine, where brilliant minds were turned away because of their birth, where dangerous ideas were burned to ash in the name of protecting souls. They reminded us that learning is never neutral, never innocent, never free from the power structures that surround it. Think about Abbot Theodoric, standing in his chamber as he threw that medical manuscript into the flames. In his mind, he wasn't destroying knowledge. He was protecting his community from ideas that might lead them astray. He believed with absolute sincerity that some truths were too dangerous for ordinary people to handle. Yet in that moment of decision, he was also deciding what future generations would be allowed to discover, what medical advances would be delayed, what suffering might continue because the knowledge to prevent it had been erased. Or consider Pope Sylvester II, the former Gerbert of Aurillac, who had to hide his mathematical genius behind layers of secrecy and political maneuvering. Even at the pinnacle of Christian authority, he couldn't openly embrace the Islamic learning that had revolutionized his understanding of the world. The very knowledge that made him brilliant was the same knowledge that made him suspect. These stories teach us something profound about the nature of institutions, even the most well-intentioned ones. The monasteries began with the noble goal of preserving wisdom and serving God, but they evolved into something more complex. Centers of power that both protected and restricted human knowledge. They showed us how even the purest faith can become tangled with questions of authority, how even the most dedicated scholars can become gatekeepers who decide what others are allowed to know. But here's what I find most remarkable about these medieval halls of learning. Despite all their contradictions, despite the censorship and the elitism and the burned manuscripts, knowledge found a way to survive and spread. Those secret copyists who preserved dangerous texts, those rebellious monks who taught peasant children in hidden corners, those brilliant minds like Gerbert who refused to be contained by the limitations of their time, they all played a part in keeping human curiosity alive. The legacy of medieval monasteries lives on in every library, every university, every place where knowledge is gathered and shared. They established the fundamental tension that still defines education today, the balance between preserving wisdom and making it accessible, between maintaining standards and ensuring equality, between respecting tradition and embracing innovation. When you walk through a modern university campus or browse the endless information available online, you're experiencing both the triumph and the ongoing challenge that began in those medieval scriptoriums. We've made knowledge more accessible than those early monks could have ever imagined. Yet, we still struggle with questions they faced. Who gets to learn? What ideas are too dangerous to share? How do we balance the needs of individual growth with the stability of society? The truth is, there are still countless secrets buried beneath the metaphorical stone steps of our own institutions. There are still manuscripts waiting to be discovered, ideas waiting to be freed from the restrictions that bind them, voices waiting to be heard that have been silenced by systems of power and privilege. Medieval monasteries taught us that knowledge is never just about facts and figures. It's about who gets to shape the future, who gets to participate in the great conversation of human progress, who gets to decide what questions are worth asking and what answers are worth pursuing. As we look back at these remarkable institutions, we can honor both their achievements and acknowledge their limitations. They saved civilization's intellectual heritage, but they also showed us the dangers of concentrating knowledge in too few hands. They preserved the past, but they also demonstrated how the present can be shaped by decisions about what information to share and what to suppress. The most important question they leave us with isn't about the past. It's about the present and future. In our own age of information abundance and educational inequality, of technological revolution and persistent barriers to learning, we still face the same fundamental choices that confronted those medieval monks. How many truths are still buried beneath the stone steps of our own institutions, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up and share them with the world? If you found this journey through medieval history as fascinating as I did, I'd love to have you join our community of history enthusiasts. Hit that like button to let me know this resonated with you, and share this video with anyone who loves diving deep into the untold stories of the past. And don't forget to subscribe to the Medieval Archives, because we're just getting started exploring the incredible, complex, and often surprising world of medieval life. There are so many more amazing stories waiting to be told, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that every stone in history's foundation has a story worth discovering.